How many people own Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency? All right. So we're going to talk about this debate. And my role is not to convince you that blockchain is good. Right? So my role, I'm a scientist and an economic professor by formation. And so my job is to really just look at data, look at facts, and then present them to you. And then maybe, hopefully, you're going to update your belief about the technology. Okay, that's my role. I'm not here to convince you to buy Bitcoin or to sell Bitcoin. All right? So just briefly, I'm going to spend 10 minutes talking about what blockchain is. And then we're gonna move, and I'm gonna start talking more about my opinion about it. So in order to understand, so blockchain is people call it a decentralized or a distributed ledger. Right? So in order to understand blockchain, we first have to agree on what a ledger is, and then we can talk about, well, centralized versus distributed ledger. Right? So when people talk about ledger, that's the first thing that actually comes into my mind, an old book where people record who owns what to whom. Right? So that's the first intuition, first idea of what a ledger is. But ledger can also be something else. Every time you sell or buy a house, that gets recorded into a ledger. So this is a very old deed of land sale. Exchanges are ledgers. So people get together in New York City, and they start or Chicago, and they start trading stocks, bonds, derivatives, and other securities. Right? So that is a ledger, because it's basically a sequence of transactions about moving value, moving securities from one person to another. Now, I'm going to start to expand the definition of a ledger, because that's the potential of blockchain. Right? So I'm going to try to convince you that a company can also be seen as a ledger. Right? So what does it mean that a company is a ledger? Well, a company, if you think about it, is a set or a sequence of transactions between customers, suppliers, employees, managers, owners of the company, government, society, and so on. So it's basically a sequence of transactions between many different parties. And the reason I'm talking about this is because we've been seeing with blockchain the creation of companies that are blockchain-based. So there are what are called the decentralized autonomous organizations. And so these are new ideas about how to not just run a company, how to structure a company. So some people describe new companies in blockchain space as simply smart contracts. Okay? You do a task, and the smart contract is going to recognize that you did this task, and you're be compensated. So I can actually write a code that basically exemplifies what a company is. Given certain input, there are some output that I'm going to verify, and then the person gets paid. Right? So now a ledger, then a company can also be seen as a ledger. Belonging to a club is a ledger. Like depending if you are in the club or not, there is basically a database that actually tells you whether you belong to a club or not. People have been thinking about using blockchain for accreditation system. If you graduate from UT, then then you belong to the UT club, and then people can verify that you actually graduated from UT or not. All our vital records, and this is the Texas vital record system, are recorded in ledgers. When you were born, if you're dead, when you died, when you were married or not, all this information are recorded in ledgers. Now, again, I'm going to expand the definition of ledger more. People have been thinking about tracking immigrants or refugees, especially from Syria to the EU, using blockchain technology. Why? Well, the idea is that every person has a human capital. And that human capital is sometimes hard to track from countries to countries. And so you can think about transacting. I know it's terrible, but this is how economists think about. You can think about, tracking human capital movement from one country to another, right? And so these are transactions, in a way. Your health records are also transactions, are also information containing transaction between me and the doctor, me and the hospital, and so on. Obviously, money is the ultimate transaction, that I exchange value from me to another person. So now you start seeing that a ledger is not simply an old book, but it has many different aspects. Right? So if I want to summarize what a ledger is, a ledger establishes a consensus about facts. That's the most generic definition of a ledger. It can be about ownership. It can be about identity, about status, about authority. So if I have to summarize in just one sentence what a ledger is, a ledger maps economic and social relationships. Why is this important? Because we've seen people talking about blockchain applications in so many different areas. And the only way you can start thinking about why it's possible for blockchain to actually impact so many different areas, or potentially impact so many different areas, is because you have to expand your definition of what a ledger is. Okay, it's not just a database. Okay? It's companies, it's transferring human capital, and so on and so on. Right? So that's the foundation. So this is what at least I believe a ledger is. Right? So if I want to create a new ledger, I have to decide what the governance of the ledger is. So what do I mean by it? Well, I need to decide who writes on the ledger, who reads the ledger, who audits the ledger, and who owns the ledger. And so these choices about read, write, audit, and own are going to determine the features of ledgers. And so this is where things are going to start to bifurcate between centralized ledger and blockchain, or decentralized ledgers. Right? So over the last, I would say, 3,000 years, since the Babylonians, 1,000 years before Christ, before the new era, people have been using centralized ledgers. What does it mean, a centralized ledger? Well, it means that the governance structure is centralized. There is only one player, one central entity that has the privileges, has permission to read, write, audit, and own the ledger. So for example, if I'm here and I want to buy coffee with my credit card, what do? I swipe my credit card, and then the information goes to my bank. My bank checks that actually I have the money. And if I have the money, the transaction is permitted, and therefore my money goes from me to the coffee shop. Right? That's the idea. The idea is there is a central entity that basically decides whether the transaction is valid or not. Right? So this applies to many different areas. The Federal Reserve, the central bank, controls, regulates the money supply. Healthcare records are stored and controlled in hospital servers. Deeds and vital records are recorded in public government ledgers. And so this has been the situation over the last 3,000 years. So now advances in cryptography and technology are starting to change that. Okay? And then we can talk about pros and cons of whether we should change and having a more decentralized ledger. But to me, if I have to summarize what is the innovation in blockchain technology, it is the following. For 3,000 years, we have been using just this system to map our economic and social relationships. All right? So maybe we can do something else. Right? And whether it's going to work or not, I don't have an answer. But intellectually, the question is, can we maybe have some ledgers, not maybe all the ledgers, but some ledgers that don't have this centralization feature, but they are more decentralized? And then we can talk about how a network can actually decide whether I have the money and I can spend it. But conceptually, to me, it's like, maybe we can try to do something different. We can try to do something that is not as centralized, but maybe there are some benefit in having a structure where there is not just a single point of failure or single entity that decides who owns, write, audit, and read the ledger. Right? So blockchain is a distributed ledger. But now we know what a ledger is. A ledger has an expanded meaning. Okay? A ledger is basically mapping social and economic relationships. And so maybe we can be in a situation where we map social and economic relationships in a decentralized way. And then we're going to talk about pros and cons of why we should do this or not. All right? But I want to establish the foundation of this is the objective. And then the question is this a good objective or is it a bad objective? All right? So what is in a blockchain name? So people have been using blockchain in so many different fields, in so many different applications, mostly use cases. And so my objective now is to provide a little bit of more clarity or more confusion about what blockchain is when people talk about blockchain. So one of the first questions that people ask me is, why do we need 2,000 cryptocurrencies? Right? So this is coin market cap for those of you who track crypto's prices every 5 minutes. So this is as of yesterday. There are about 2,074 cryptocurrencies. And so one of the questions that I always get is, why do we, I understand we need Bitcoin, we just need one. Maybe Ethereum because it's a platform for smart contracts. But why do we need 2,000 of them? And so the idea is, look, there are many different ways I can structure a ledger. So going back to the idea is, what defines a blockchain or a distributed ledger is who is allowed to read and write a database, going back to the definition of what a ledger is. Who decides whether the transactions in the ledger are valid or not, and what kind of consensus mechanism you actually use. And then there are some choices about blockchain architecture, block size, privacy, anonymity, speed of transactions, whether you can run smart contracts or not, and so on. And finally, which is I think is also very important, especially for enterprise solutions, is who is responsible or liable if things go wrong. Because this is also, especially for enterprises, this is actually very important. Things often go wrong, and the question is who is liable, who is responsible for this. So I'm going to start classifying blockchains. And the first main classification that people talk about is a classification about who has permission to read and write. So there are basically two main categories that you can put all these cryptos in buckets. The first one is a permissionless or a public blockchain. So all the cryptos, all the 2,074 cryptos that you have seen, these are all for the large majority, permissionless blockchain. What it means? It means that anyone has the right to access and validate transactions. The second category is what's called a permissioned system, where it basically says not everyone can actually read, write, and validate transactions, but only a selected few. And so this is most enterprise applications use a permissioned blockchain using systems like Hyperledger, Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, Corda, Quorum, and so on, so on, so on. Okay? So to me, at the beginning is, well, what's the, in one category, people can validate anyone can validate transactions. In the other, only select a few. Why is that such a big deal? And I'm going to tell you that this is actually the most important feature of a blockchain. And this drives most of the other choices about features of governance of blockchains. Let's start with permissionless blockchain, and I'm going to tell you why this is important. All right? If you think about permissionless blockchain, how do you come to a consensus? So let's assume that I want to buy coffee, all right? And you all guys have a ledger. So how do you all guys are nodes that are trying to validate whether I have the money or the Bitcoin to buy coffee? Okay? What's the simple system we can do? So you can all look at my portfolio and see whether I have the money and I haven't spent it. The simple system, if you all are the nodes that validate or mine Bitcoins, what's the simple system? You vote. Okay? Everybody's going to check whether I have the money or not and whether I haven't spent it. And then if the transaction is valid, everybody's raising their hands. If 51% of you decide that the transaction is valid, or 75, or whatever quorum you want to use, then the transaction is valid, it is appended to the ledger. What is the problem with that? So the simple idea is say, look, in a distributed system, let's just take a vote. Let's just take a poll. If 51% agree, then transaction is valid, like democracy. Well, the problem is this. Do you know who this person is? Her name is Sybil Ardell Manson. She was the first person diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. Doctor said that she had 16 different personalities. So why I'm actually talking about this? Because in blockchain, there is what's called a Sybil attack. So what is the best way to actually abuse the system in a voting system? Well, if anyone can access and vote, then I can create fake personalities. So do you know how many nodes there are in the Bitcoin network today? Do you have a sense? Order of magnitude? Millions? 7,000. Okay? There are 7,000 validators or miners in the Bitcoin network. So if I want to actually steal all your Bitcoin, what will be the easiest way to do it? I create 7,001 new computers. It's not very expensive to buy one computer. I can buy 7,000 computers. And then each one is going to vote in the way that I believe is in my best interest. Okay? This is what's called a Sybil attack. Sybil, starting from the fact I can create fake personalities, and they're all going to vote in the way that is good for me. All right? So so this is the problem with permissionless blockchain. If anyone can access the database and start voting, then it's easy to replicate, to create fake personalities. So how do you solve this? Well, this is the invention of Satoshi Nakamoto. That basically said, well, he was not the first one. He was the first one to actually put all these pieces together. They basically said, one way to solve this is to make this validator put some effort. What does it mean to put some effort? That I want them to start, solving some meaningless cryptographic puzzles. So now, if I have 7,001 new nodes, the only way for me to actually change the transaction is if I have to expend energy in each one of these 7,001 nodes to basically change transactions. So this is called proof of work. So the way you can think about it is, instead of counting the votes of each one of you, I'm going to count the vote of each one of you depending on how much work you have done. I'm going to weigh your vote depending on how much work you have done. Why is this solving the problem? Because now the only way I can cheat is if I have 51% of the computing power in the network. Okay? Just to give you an idea, how much energy is the Bitcoin network consuming a year? How much? It's a lot, but how much? It's about 70 terawatt hour, so how much is it? 70 terawatt hour. Well, over the last week, actually, it went down because the hash rate went down. But it's about, so I'm Italian, it's about 15% of all the energy consumed in Italy. It's more than energy consumed in Algeria, right now, as of today. And why is that? Because in order to validate the network, you have to prove that you've done some work. Because if there is no proof of work, then I can create fake personalities. But then if there is a proof of work, I have to actually have my computer do something, then I'm going to have to spend a lot of energy. And so it's become almost impossible to actually get 51% of the computing power. So that's the main intuition about, and so there are several ways to implement this, several proofs to establish consensus. But the main simple idea is, look, I cannot simply count each vote, but I'm going to weight each vote depending on how much work they've done. Okay? If my computer is running very, very fast, my computer has more voting power than other computers. This is not exactly how it is, but that's the intuition behind it. Does it make sense? So this is for permissionless blockchain. Now we're going to go to more enterprise solutions. So permissioned blockchain are different. Why? Remember? Because now not everybody can actually access the network, create transactions, validate transactions. So now if it's a permission system, I don't have a Sybil problem anymore. Why? Because I know all the nodes. I cannot, if I am in a permission system, I cannot create 7,001 new nodes because the consortium is not going to allow me to. So if I don't have any Sybil attack risk, then I don't have to do all this proof of work. So many people say, oh, blockchain technology is not good because it consumes too much energy. First of all, even in the permissionless space, people are trying to actually solve this problem. And second, for permissioned system, you don't even have this problem. It's not going to consume any energy, or very little energy. So how do you do this? Well, it has to be a consortium that gets together and decide what the rules of the game are. So what is the problem of this? The problem is that some critics argue that it's not really decentralized, or it's not decentralized enough. That's the main concern that people have. Because there is a consortium, there is a central entity, in a way, that basically assigns permission on who has to access and read and write on the ledger, and therefore is not really decentralized. Which I'm sympathetic to that point of view, but I'm going to tell you my opinion about blockchain pretty soon. So these are examples of permissioned ledgers. These are mostly open source systems that allow enterprises and companies to basically create their own blockchain networks. One is Hyperledger, run by the Linux Foundation. And the idea is they're going to have a lot of companies coming in, contributing to the code in an open source way, so that if I want to create my own permissioned blockchain network, I can do it using the infrastructure of the Hyperledger. The other one is Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. These are almost very similar systems, but simply they are started by different people. But the idea is I'm going to create a private network where only select a few people can access the network, and that increases performance of blockchains a lot, but decreases decentralization. All right? So after I introduced to you what a ledger is and what blockchain is and the main categories of blockchain, now I'm going to start talking about my personal opinion about blockchain. And most of it is most of the changes that I think needs to happen is in the way we talk about it. We need to be able to communicate better and more clearly what are the advantages and disadvantages of the network, of using blockchain technology. So let me start with this. First one, this is what people usually talk about when they talk about blockchain. Blockchain is a trustless, decentralized, and transparent ledger. And I have issue about each one of these characteristics of blockchain. So let's start with trustless. So let me give you the main argument about why blockchains are trustless. The idea is the following. Look, in a centralized ledger, when I buy coffee, I have to trust my bank. I have to trust that my bank is going to validate the transaction in the right way. With Bitcoin or any other permissionless system, I don't have to trust a single player because the network is going to have the right incentives so that each one of the nodes in the network is going to behave, is going to approve the transaction only when the transaction is valid. So I don't have to trust anyone. And so I don't need to rely on trust. So this is where I start having problems in the way people communicate. Because, so I'm an economist, and we never talk about trust. Never. So let me ask you, do you guys trust your bank? Yes? No? How many people trust your bank? How many people don't trust your bank? So when people ask me, do you trust your bank? I reframe the question. So I trust them with my money, but they can't trust me with their pens. All right? So when people ask me, do you trust the bank? And in my mind, in my economics mind, the way I frame the question is the following. Well, I need to what the person is asking me is, what is the likelihood that my money is going to be there tomorrow? Or a year from now? Or when I retire 30 years from now? And so if I have to think about what are the probabilities that my money is safe, I have to think about what is the bank doing with my money? What are they investing money in? And then I have to think about the FDIC insurance. How safe is the FDIC insurance? And eventually, if that fails, how safe is the government? So the idea is I need to look at the whole ecosystem and try to form an opinion about what is the likelihood that the system is going to fail and that I'm not going to get my money back. That's how economists think. They don't think about trust versus no trust. They think about what are the likelihood that the system is going to fail or not. And then I'm not going to get my money back. So I think the conversation about blockchain trust versus non-trust, centralized versus non-centralized system, is not really about trust versus no trust. It's about I'm going to look at the ecosystem of my bank or of my blockchain, and I have to come up with the probabilities on whether what is the likelihood that my money or my Bitcoin is going to be there tomorrow, a year from now, or 30 years from now. Okay? So I don't have an answer on whether a centralized system like a bank is safer in terms of probability versus a decentralized system like Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin has subject to 51% attack. Okay? How likely is that going to happen? I don't know. But also, you have to compare that with how likely is that your money is not going to be in the bank anymore tomorrow when you go and try and cash it out. So maybe in the US, that probability of me going to the bank and not having my money is very low. But maybe in some other country, it is higher. So in Greece, during the Euro crisis, well, banks were not, they were shut down, and you were not able to actually get your money back. But eventually, they did. Okay? In Venezuela, you might have similar problems. So the idea of trusting the bank or not, it's simply about probabilities. How likely it is that I'm going to get my money back or not. And then I'm going to compare Bitcoin system or a blockchain system versus a centralized system. So I have issue about the way we talk about it. It's not about a binary choice of trustless versus trust. So I don't want to talk about ideals. I want to talk about economic variables, like probability that I'm going to get my money back. So if I want to tell that Bitcoin is a better system than a centralized bank system, then just tell me what are the odds of me losing my money in a centralized system versus what are the odds in a decentralized system. That's the conversation I would like to have with people. Second feature is decentralization. And here there is a game that people play about, my crypto is more decentralized than your crypto. All right? And to me, look, decentralization is an idea. What I care about is not whether you are more centralized or you're fully decentralized or fully centralized. The question is, does this help me in any way or not? A fully decentralized system is sometimes highly inefficient. And so maybe I might care about safety, but not if that impacts my performance. And maybe a full centralized system is maybe not as safe, but is performing very, very well. So my point is that, look, obviously there is a spectrum of how centralized and decentralized things are, but that doesn't mean that the fully decentralized are much better than the fully centralized system. And it's not that the more decentralized, the better. Every aspect of a system, of a network, is important. And so I'm going to have to weight different features of a payment system or a supply chain system, and so on and so on. The last feature of a blockchain that people talk about is transparency. Right? And the idea is, look, I can actually go on online, download the ledger of Bitcoin, and see all the transactions. It's anonymous, pseudo-anonymous. People can actually sometimes be tracked. But the idea is everything is transparent, everything is out there. Now, when I hear about this, it's like, look, bank can simply post on their website all the transactions. They can, isn't it? There's nothing stopping it. If I can anonymize all the transactions of Bank of America, if I'm the CEO, and I can post online all the transactions, would you be happy if all the Bank of America transactions were online and available to anyone? Well, probably not for privacy reasons, even if it's anonymized. So the idea is that transparency has some benefit in some applications, but not others. And so to me, the fact that sometimes everything is transparent doesn't mean that it's actually good. Sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be bad, depending on the application. And so just touting blockchain as a trustless, decentralized, and transparent ledger is not helpful. It's not helpful because it's unclear to me that these three main variables are the important ones. So people say, OK, this is the golden triangle of blockchain. It's decentralization, transparency, and trust. And to me, these are ideals, but these are not economic variables that actually can help me decide whether the blockchain system is better than a centralized system. Right? So I teach fintech to my students, and usually every time they claim, this is a new application of technology in finance, I always ask them, think in economic terms. Right? Instead of thinking about technology, decentralization, transparency, trustless, think about where you add value. Right? And so these are the main 6 ways you can create value in anything, pretty much. Right? It's about unit cost. Do you make something cheaper? Do you reduce asymmetric information, the lemons problem? Do you reduce agency conflicts between different parties involved in transaction? Do you reduce risk? Do you reduce search cost? Do you reduce latency? Do you make things more convenient? So the way I would like to frame the discussion about blockchain is not about distributed transparency and trust. I actually would like to propose a new triangle, which is Is it convenient? Is it cheaper? Is it safer? And so that, to me, is the way we should talk about blockchain technology. Is about, and that's the reason why I think blockchain hasn't really been adopted by the masses, because people talk about ideals, decentralization, trust, and so on, instead of talking about what really matters to people. And what really matters to people is my money safe? Is it cheaper to transact? Is it more convenient to transact? And so I think that the discussion has to be framed around economic variables rather than ideals. All right? So is blockchain good for you? All right? So sometimes I get emails, people say, hey, is blockchain good for my company? And I didn't make these slides. Actually, this flow chart comes from it comes from the Linux Foundation, Hyperledger. But it's a very nice flow chart that actually illustrates when blockchain is good for you, for your company. Right? The first one is, again, blockchain is about coordination among many different players. Think about the supply chain, moving lettuce from the farmer to the store shelves of a supermarket. Is there a need for a shared common database? If it's not, well, you don't need blockchain. And then you go down and say, are multiple parties involved? If there's just one party involved? So for example, UPS, okay, they ship packages. Do they use blockchain? No, but they can track packages. Why UPS is not ever going to use blockchain technology? Because it's all owned by the same company. And they can track, and they have their own internal system, very efficient, that track packages from origin to destination. So they don't have to coordinate across many different companies. In supply chain, you said you have to. You have to coordinate between your upstream supplier and your downstream customers. And so are there multiple parties involved? If yes, then we can keep going. Do they have conflicting interests? Or they're not trusted? Are the rules governing participants uniform? Do you change the rules very often? Do you need an objective, immutable log? If all these things are yes, then you probably might consider using a blockchain. And if you need transparency, then you can use a public blockchain. If not, if you care about performance more, you can use a permissioned blockchain. All right, so let me talk very briefly about the last point. The last point is, OK, so I understand all this. Should I buy Bitcoin or not? Or should I sell my Bitcoin that I actually currently have? So you guys are probably familiar with this. This is the market cap of all the cryptocurrencies in the world. It peaked at close to $800 billion around the end of December. Nowadays, we're back to basically where we started about a year and a half ago. There's high volatility. This is a typical boom and bust cycle common to new technologies. Now, the question is, what's going to happen going forward? So I would like to distinguish between, again, permissioned and permissionless blockchain. In the permissioned world, the value of blockchain is going to be determined by simply weighting pros and cons of blockchain technology. But we're going to have to talk about this in economic terms and not ideal terms. So people talk about supply chain, identity, tokenization of assets, smart contract, clearing and trading, payment remittances. So these are all the possible application of blockchain. But again, I think we really clearly have to look at the benefit and cost of each one of the applications in real economic terms. Not everything is going to be on a blockchain. Again, UPS is not going to use a blockchain. It doesn't need to, because it's just one company. And it's a centralized system are a lot easier than decentralized system when there's only one party involved. When we're measuring value, whether a blockchain is good or not, you have to consider the benchmark. Sometimes just doing an IT upgrade is just enough. So it's not simply weighting benefit and cost, but you also have to think about what is the next best alternative. Is simply updating my IT system good enough or not? So, OK, I understand still, should I buy my Bitcoin or not? So let's talk about the permissionless world. Cryptocurrencies are only one of the applications of blockchain technology, but it's the one that is talked about the most. So usually, I'm a finance professor, so we like to value stuff. And I have very, not good model, but like at least I have models that allow me to determine whether Tesla is underpriced or overpriced. So I have some framework that allows me to decide this kind of cash flow models or multiples models. So we have models, technology, that allows us to say whether Tesla is underpriced or overpriced. But when it comes to cryptocurrencies are not equity. They're not like bond. So they don't behave like in any way like any other asset that we've been valuing. So this is a question I always ask. Is Bitcoin worth $20,000? Or is it worth $4,000 or $10? How do we value this asset? So we don't have a model for this. However, people talk about, well, what are the benefits of why should Bitcoin have any value? Well, people talk about store of value or means of exchange or interaction between the two. And then I'm almost done, and then I'm going to take questions. So store of value. So people say, this is the new gold. Okay? And my answer as an economic professor is we don't like the old gold. Okay? Like gold is a bubble. The only reason why you want to hold gold is because there is this self-confirming equilibrium where the only reason I'm going to buy gold is because people in the future are going to believe that they can actually sell the gold at somebody else is going to take the gold and sell it to somebody else. But gold is not a productive asset. When I think about productive asset, I think about stocks, bonds, real estate, anything that produces something. You own something that actually produces something. Gold doesn't produce anything. In fact, no single economist is going to recommend that you buy gold because it's not a productive asset. When you think about storing value, I don't know you, but I invest in stocks and bonds. Why? I'm going to store my value by putting it in productive asset that are going to return me some money. I don't just take my money and stuff it under the mattress or buy gold and hope that somebody else in the future is going to think that it has value only because they can unload it off to somebody else. Okay? I like to buy productive assets rather than unproductive assets. So for economists, we don't like the old gold. So if you tell me it's the new gold, well, it's not a big improvement here. All right? Now, the second one is means of exchange. And the idea is, look, just because I'm using this token, this as money, it should have a value. Dollars have value. Euros have value. And therefore, if I'm starting using Bitcoin, that should have value. And so we have some ways to determine the value of currencies. Why is the exchange rate of euro versus dollar is 1.14 today? Well, we don't really know exactly why, but we have models that allows us to determine, OK, the reason could be because of trades and so on. Right? So the issue here is the following. I didn't invent this. This is actually public information and knowledge. The issue is about velocity. Okay? Let's assume that I want to buy coffee, and I don't have any Bitcoin. So I'm going to buy Bitcoin, give the Bitcoin to my, well, not one Bitcoin, but a fraction of a Bitcoin to my coffee shop. And the coffee shop doesn't want to hold Bitcoin, so they're going to put it back on the exchange. How long does this loop take? Do you have a sense? So I buy the Bitcoin on exchange. I use it to buy coffee. And then the coffee owner takes the Bitcoin, puts it back on exchange. How long does it take in terms of time? Do you have a sense? This is true if you go through the blockchain. If you use Coinbase, milliseconds. Okay, especially if you do atomic swaps and so on, milliseconds. All right? So how many transactions are done by Visa every second? 15,000? So how many Bitcoins do I need? 100? Like if I can use a Bitcoin every millisecond, I use a Bitcoin, somebody else is using another Bitcoin, and so on, so on, so on. So how many Bitcoins do I need? 100? Actually, I don't even have one Bitcoin. I can use one Satoshi, which is 10 to the minus 8 Bitcoins. All right? So maybe I need 1,000 Bitcoin to, if I really have to. The problem is that how many Bitcoins are in the world? 21 million? Well, not yet, but eventually there are going to be 21 million. So this is what's called the velocity problem. Bitcoin moves too fast. All right? So any digital cash has very high velocity, which is actually good. If I'm an engineer, I want to have a system where I just need one coin. I just need one coin. I use it, somebody else uses it, and so on, so on, so on. This is, for an engineer perspective, this is very useful. It's very efficient. But then what happens when you play 21 million and you only need one? Okay, this is the velocity problem. And then I'm going to, one slide, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. Huh? So main takeaway, look, blockchain technology is still a proof of concept. I want to make sure that there is more clarity in how we talk about permissionless versus permission blockchain. And I would like to have more clarity on the way we talk about benefit and cost of using blockchain technology. The industry has been going through a phase of hype expectations, and lately a lot of impatience and disillusionment. So I think it's very imperative to communicate clearly and actually measure quantitatively and objectively the pros and cons of the technology. All right? So with that, I'm going to open up the questions. You had a question? Do you want to come over so that people can hear?
I think in the example you gave about me buying Bitcoin, giving it to you,
yeah.
Giving me coffee, and then you take Bitcoin and selling, you're assuming then that I start with a dollar
Correct.
to buy the Bitcoin.
Correct.
I guess a question would be, how does the IRS view that transaction? And what are my reporting requirements?
That's good. So this is a great question. So the IRS basically considers Bitcoin as an asset. And so every time you buy and sell an asset, you have capital gains and capital losses, and for which you have to pay taxes. When you use Bitcoin as a means of exchange, buy coffee, the IRS is still a little unclear how you value that. Other questions? Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Learned a lot. But I'm still unclear. You've kind of described what blockchain is, but it's not clear to me what as you say here, the pros and cons are. What are the pros? Why have people done this or come up with this in the first place? What are the pros to decentralization?
Absolutely. So people have been exploring use cases about blockchain technology for the last 3-4 years. And every time you do a use case, I would like to see numbers. So I've seen use cases say, oh yeah, we can apply the technology for exchanges, or we can apply the technologies for supply chain, okay? But I haven't seen, yes, you can. The question is it a better technology than we currently have? And so just because you can apply blockchain doesn't mean that you should use blockchain. And so I haven't seen numbers. That's why I'm saying I think we need to change the way we communicate about this. Go beyond the decentralization mantra, but talk more about economic value.
Do you have models about the cost of a transaction? If Visa's processing 15,000 transactions a second, and I know there's a lot less volume going through the blockchain, and you're using 10% of the power of Italy, how can that be efficient? What's the cost differential, and how's that ever going to work out if this proof of work is so expensive energy-wise?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Clearly, proof of work is not a scalable solution, okay? And people have been trying to change that. So a proof of stake with other type of proof of work. The conundrum there is that the reason why the ledger is immutable is exactly because you're spending all this energy. Okay, so the conundrum is, on one way, I don't want to spend all this energy producing Bitcoin and verifying Bitcoin. On the other hand, the only way I can actually make the ledger safe is people spend all this money producing, like spending energy to validate the network. Okay, that's the conundrum that you have there. Clearly, right now, is a lot more expensive to process a transaction with Bitcoin than to process a transaction with Visa. A lot more expensive. Unless you transact like millions of dollars. Because for Bitcoin, it doesn't matter whether you're transacting $1 or 1 million. Okay? So maybe for very, very large transactions, maybe Bitcoin is better. But for everyday transaction, we're not there. But we might get there.
I guess I was just going to push you on that one a little
Yeah.
bit. When you add up all of the energy in banking, say that all, with the network processing system that's going through the merchant bank and your bank, all of that sort of infrastructure, people, time, money, technology, data center, and so forth, doesn't that also, I guess, have you seen data to compare that cost, sort of the whole cost of that single transaction?
So all these costs should be embedded in the cost of the transaction. So when I buy coffee, the system is going to charge me, well, not me, but the merchant is going to charge me 2.5%. Okay, part of it is profit for the banking system that actually does that, but technically, those costs should be embedded in how much I pay when I actually make a transaction. So now I know that they probably charge 2.5%. Debit card charge less, maybe 1.5%. Credit card charge 2 and 2.5%, but that's because they're providing also a credit. So I think the best comparison will be debit card. Okay, so can I compare the debit card, the 1% fee for a debit card, versus the Bitcoin transaction? Right now, Bitcoin transactions are still very expensive because you don't have to count only the fees, but also you have to look at the block premium award, and you have to spread the block premium award across all the transactions. Yeah.
Wouldn't you also have to add in the value of the credit? So the default and sort of by using a credit card, the bank just doesn't make that 3%. They also make the financing charges for debt and all that other.
Correct. That's what I'm saying. Like, I think the best benchmark is comparing debit cards, where you don't because Bitcoin is you're not gonna pay your Bitcoin 30 days later. So when you use a credit card, it's a mix between credit and the actual transactions. Okay. So if I want to compare Bitcoin, I should compare it with the actual transaction, which is most similar to a debit card in a way.
Thank you, Cesare. I understand like the transactional part of it, but I don't understand the value part of it, how Bitcoin gets its value. Is it a commodity like pork belly? It's tell us some more about that.
So this is the biggest problem here with value in Bitcoin. Again, like I don't like it as a store of value because I don't own gold, so I don't see why I should actually buy Bitcoin to store my value for the future, for retirement. Unless I'm in extreme situations, like Venezuela. And for transaction, again, I think they printed too many coins. Okay? What happens when you have a supply of 21 million and a demand of 1,000 or less? That's the problem. Please.
What does it mean to mine Bitcoin or mine any other cryptocurrency?
Yeah.
What does that mean to mine it?
To mine it, yeah.
And why is that so energy intensive?
Yeah.
And why is blockchain as a process so energy intensive? Mm-hmm. And will that go down
over time?
And for what reason would cause it, the cost and energy required go
Absolutely.
down.
So this goes back to when I was talking about Sybil attacks. So one way I can cheat the system is if I create 7,000 new fake personalities. Okay? And so the way you can combat that is to say, okay, you can vote, but your vote counts depending on how much work you have done. Okay? The work meaning you have to basically solve these meaningless cryptographic puzzles. Huh? And so your vote counts more if you process more, if you actually solve more of these puzzles. Huh? And so why is that? Why would miners want to solve these cryptographic puzzles? Is because they get the fees. So every time you pay you transact with Bitcoin, you pay a little piece of the Bitcoin to the miner. And also you get what's called a block reward. They create new Bitcoin and give it to you. Huh? So mining means I'm going to solve these meaningless cryptographic puzzles, and that allows me, if I win the puzzle, solve the puzzle before everybody else, I'm going to get a reward. And that's why it's called mining. Yeah, please.
So I had a question around permission blockchains.
Yeah.
Where do you see that ecosystem is evolving? Are you seeing big conglomerates making these permission blockchains, and then how is that going to be any better than a centralized system? So
Okay.
if you can compare a permission blockchain to a centralized system.
Absolutely. So let me give an example. This is a great question. So Walmart now is the first company that actually is rolling out a blockchain system in a production world. Okay? So the way they're doing it, one of the big issues about food safety is that if you go to a supermarket right now, you buy spinach, you don't know where that spinach comes from. Not only you don't know, but also Walmart doesn't know where that spinach comes from. It takes them about 2 weeks to figure out where that spinach comes from. And the reason is because there is no coordination between all the suppliers in the supply chain of Walmart lettuce or spinach. So why there is no coordination is because everybody uses a different system. And not only the spinach producer produce for Walmart, but they also produce it for Costco, H-E-B, and so on, so on, so on. So one of the benefits, actually, I think the most important benefit of blockchain is that it increases coordination. Now, can you do it with just a simple server? So people say, if I use a simple server and every company writes on the server, isn't that the same? Some people argue that a permissioned blockchain is simply a simple server. In fact, you hear people using blockchain on a cloud, which to me sounds like a cloud is just a centralized system, and now you're using blockchain on a cloud. So that's why I'm saying the degree of centralization is like they are partially decentralized, but not very much. Now, why we don't want to have a central system to track lettuce for Walmart? Well, the reason is because, yes, you can do the same thing with UPS. The reason is that the spinach producer doesn't only produce for Walmart. So they will have to use a system for Walmart, a system for a blockchain for Costco, a blockchain for H-E-B, and that's impractical. Okay? So the only solution is for all the supermarket grocery stores to come together and say, now we're going to use a single universal blockchain where all the transactions are going to be on this ledger.
This will be our last question.
Okay.
This somewhat relates to that in what level of human consensus does it take to make cryptocurrencies effective? You talked about Venezuela and Greece, and take Iran, for instance, with economic sanctions.
Yeah.
Governments are punishing governments, but it really punishes the population. Iran has oil tied to the dollar. The government isn't very threatened, but the people are.
Yeah.
And people don't make good choices when their subsistence is threatened.
Yeah.
So can you imagine people having enough access to cryptocurrencies where it could start to mitigate those punishing effects of sanctions on a general population?
This is a very interesting question, and it's also a little tricky to answer. So let me tell you, people say, Cryptocurrencies are good because I can go beyond all the capital controls that happen in countries like China and Venezuela and so on. So these are ways to evade capital controls imposed by government. And I mean, do we want that? Like, people might make the same argument. There are anti-money laundering laws in the US, and Bitcoin is a way to evade anti-money laundering. Well, is that a good thing? Well, there is a reason why we have anti-money laundering laws. Huh? And maybe there is a reason why Chinese has capital controls. Maybe they don't want to destabilize the economy too much. So, yes, if you believe that there is a government that is exploiting their citizens, maybe cryptocurrencies are good. The question is unclear to me. Whether whether Bitcoin is beneficial because of capital controls evasion versus anti-money laundering evasion. So it's a trick to answer that. All right, thank you so much.